Hello everyone and welcome to week 2 of Principles of Macroeconomics. Coming to you from the same blank, empty, dark void as usual, I'm your host Michna. And this week is going to be a little bit different, not just from the past week, but also from future weeks, because this course mostly sticks to the textbook very closely. We go chapter by chapter, week by week, for the most part. This week, however, will be a little bit different, because we only have a very short reading from the textbook, that chapter 1.4, chapter 1, section 4. And then I gave you some extra readings in the assignments tab for this week on Blackboard. And there's a reason for that. The topic this week is economic systems, both past ones, how we got to where we are today, and also, well, past and present ones, more recent ones, different economic systems that have existed in the modern world, or that exist in the world today that are not the one that we have in the United States. So economic systems, basically, and how we got here. Now, that topic is treated very briefly in the textbook and in most introductory economic textbooks, and you can see why. They want to get to the, what they consider to be the important part, which is the economics of the system that exists in the United States today. And that's fair. But I'm very interested in economic history. It's one of my main fields of focus. And I think history is very important to understand the present. I will be referencing history many times when we get to many other topics this semester. GDP and what it was like before we had a way to measure the economy and why GDP was invented. I'll be talking about money and how that came about and why we have the type of money that we have today. Industrialization and back to GDP. One of the reasons why GDP may not be an accurate way to measure progress in industrializing countries. So the point is, there will be many topics throughout this course, and actually throughout pretty much any economics course, where it is very useful and very important to know how we got here, how we got to the economic system that we have today, and how past economics was different from the present. It will also be important on several occasions to know about other economic systems, to know about socialism, not just about capitalism, and to realize that there are different types of capitalism and also, of course, different types of socialism that either have existed or have been proposed and have not been implemented in history but might be implemented in the future. So this week we're going to have, I'm going to divide it into 2 videos. One about how we got here, about past economic systems, and one about, well, I'm just going to call it economic systems, but it's about more recent ones, modern ones. Let's start with how we got here. And we will start with the beginning, and I mean the way beginning. We are going back to early humans. We are going back to hunter-gatherer societies. Because basically, from the economic standpoint, the 2 most important things that happened in human history were the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. Your readings, I have a reading about the industrial revolution, nothing about agriculture in the readings, but that's okay. I'll just be speaking about it. So the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, the invention of agriculture and the invention of modern industry, are the 2 most important things that happened in all of human history from an economics perspective. And these 2 dividing lines separate between them 3 different stages of human history, of human society, of human economic activity. Now, if there are historians among you, you're about to say, this guy is oversimplifying, it's not that simple, you can't really divide all of history into just 3 stages. And that's true, that's absolutely true, but I'm just presenting a sort of very broad bird's eye view. It's just it's a model of human history. So very broadly speaking, leaving aside a lot of important detail, we can divide human history from the economic perspective, from the economic point of view, into 3 periods, 3 stages, if you will. The longest stage that actually had most of the time that humans have existed on this planet. So the chronologically, the longest stage of history was really prehistory. It was the time when humans lived in hunter-gatherer societies. What do we mean by hunter-gatherer societies? Well, I'm talking about the period that is sometimes stereotypically called the Stone Age, the Paleolithic and the part of the Mesolithic and Neolithic. I'm talking about the period before recorded history, when people lived in small groups. Population numbers for the whole planet were very low. This period covers most of the time that humans have existed, but only a small number of the humans that have lived in hunter-gatherer societies because they had such small populations. And the thing about hunter-gatherer societies, some of whom exist today still, is that they didn't have agriculture. They didn't have animal husbandry. In other words, they didn't grow their own food, whether by growing plants and eating them or by growing animals and eating them. No, they hunted animals and they gathered various types of plant food. So they were nomadic. They moved from place to place necessarily. So one of the features of this type of society, and perhaps the most important one, is that economic activity was focused on survival. And I mean survival from day to day. Finding enough food to eat today, and then the next day finding enough food to eat tomorrow, and so on. Food could be kept, some of it, some hardy foods, like some types of vegetable perhaps, or roots and other things like that. But most food could not be kept for very long. Meat will go bad after a while, especially in a warm climate, especially if you don't have any form of refrigeration, of course, which they didn't. So most food will go bad. Fruit, of course, will also go bad very quickly. So for the most part, you have to gather or hunt for today or maybe for the next few days, for the next week or 2 weeks. Of course, they didn't have a concept of weeks. That's a modern concept. But you have to gather the food as you go along. They were nomadic societies that lived from day to day, or at least from a group of days to another group of days, from month to month. Because they were focused on survival, because the goal was to just find enough food to live, they also had little to no property. It's important to distinguish between property and possession, because property is a concept that really only developed in human beings after the invention of agriculture. That doesn't mean that people didn't have stuff. That doesn't mean that people didn't have a concept of this is mine before then. Of course they did. They had that concept in hunter-gatherer societies as well. But what I mean is, take for example, this roll of paper towel. I am holding it. Perhaps I am using it to wipe some stuff off the screen. It is mine. Okay. In any society, pretty much any human society, this object, which I have in my possession, in my hand right now, that I am using, is considered to be mine. Even if that society has no concept of what we call property. And let me explain how that works. Suppose I take this object, I'm done using it, I'm done doing whatever I was going to do with it, and I leave it here, and then I go away. I walk away. And then you cannot see me anymore. I am somewhere else. That object is still there. The question then is, can you take it and use it for yourself and go leave it somewhere else? In a society that has no concept of property, the answer is yes. If you see an object that was made by someone or that was clearly used by someone, but with no other humans around, or nobody else is interested in it right now, nobody else is using it right now, you can pick it up and use it for yourself. You can take this, use it, leave it somewhere else. That is what we mean when we say that a society has no concept of property. Not that people would just steal stuff from each other all the time, but that when an object is left unattended, when there's nobody around it, nobody's using it, then it's free for the taking. That's what it means to not have property. In our societies, since the agricultural revolution, in most societies since the agricultural revolution, we have this concept of property, which can be described as, I suppose, possession at a distance. A thing can still be mine even if I'm nowhere near it. A thing can still be mine even if the thing and myself are separated by a large distance. That is property. That's how it's different from possession. So societies, early human societies, had little to no property, in the sense that what was yours was just the things that you were carrying on your person right now. And if you abandoned something, you left it somewhere, then it was no longer yours. Somebody else could take it, and that was fine. Everybody understood that. All right, so survival. little to no property. There was also little to no economic surplus. Now, in this context, what I mean by surplus is resources that are above and beyond what people need for survival. There was very little of that. In other words, it was all just food. What they produced was all just food and tools that were useful in gathering food. And clothes to keep themselves, to defend themselves, protect themselves from the elements. This means, another feature of hunter-gatherer societies, that there was also very little in the way of class distinctions. Let's see, can I fit this here? Little to no class distinctions. What do I mean by that? Well, since these were societies where everything was about survival, and it was daily survival, or at least monthly survival, everybody had to work. There could not be emperors or kings or another sort of privileged class that just ruled and didn't participate in the activities necessary for survival. Now, that doesn't mean that these were that hunter-gatherer societies are some sort of like egalitarian communal paradise. No, definitely not. Although some, perhaps, individual societies, some specific examples can be considered that, but for the most part, no. They had leaders, they had subordinates, but they didn't have these massive differences between rich and poor because everybody was involved in constantly trying to survive. It wasn't because of some sort of ideology or a decision. It wasn't a decision that could be made. No other decision was available. Everybody had to do their best to ensure the survival of the group, the survival of the family, or the extended family, I should say, or the tribe. So there can be no emperors, there can be no kings, there can be no professional warrior class. There are warriors, but those warriors are also hunters, and they also gather food, and they also do other things. Okay, so these were hunter-gatherer societies, and they existed because humans had to engage in the collection of food on a daily basis. There was no surplus, there was no property, there was no concept of property because you had to move around all the time. The only objects that you had, the permanent objects, were whatever you could carry on your person. But then something changed after the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Not immediately, it was a change that took thousands of years. But basically what happened was that some human groups discovered plants that you could tend, that you could help grow. And if you helped them to grow, they would grow in larger quantities, and they would produce food for you. And then you could eat that food. You no longer had, those people who found this realized that if you gather enough of these plants, eventually you will no longer have to move around and forage for food. You can just survive on the food that you grow yourself. Other people did something similar with animals. Dogs had been domesticated for a very long time. Many hunter-gatherer societies had dogs. But now, people discovered that you can domesticate other animals too. Chickens, goats, sheep, later cattle, later than that, horses. And these animals, some of them would produce milk, others you could slaughter for meat. And some, of course, would produce eggs. So plants and animals that you could raise, that you could grow, and that would provide food for you. That was a major innovation. One of the two most important things that humans did in history, arguably, in the economics opinion, and that was the agricultural revolution. Now, to call it an event is a bit of a stretch because it's not like it happened overnight. It didn't even happen in one generation or even in 10 generations. It took thousands of years. This idea of agriculture probably started independently, was invented separately by different people in different locations. We know that it started in the Middle East. We know that it started in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in India, and also around the valley of the Yangtze River in China. And much later, of course, also agriculture was also invented by Mesoamerican peoples in what is now Central America and the Andes. So different people groups in different parts of the world, separately from each other, invented this idea of raising plants and animals for food, so you no longer have to hunt or forage all the time. And like I said, this is sometimes called the agricultural revolution. It took thousands of years to spread across the world, and it resulted in the creation of a new type of society, agricultural societies. Agricultural societies are, well, they cover pretty much every type of society that existed from the beginning of recorded history up until very recently, up until a few hundred years ago. So there are many different types of agricultural societies, of course. But focusing on the early ones, on the first ones that arose, think of ancient Egypt, think of ancient Mesopotamia, think of ancient India or China. Civilizations developed mostly around rivers. Why rivers? Well, because, again, this new invention, plants that you could grow, needed water. So obviously the easiest source of fresh water were rivers. So that's where the first agricultural civilizations developed. And they were different from hunter-gatherer societies in many ways. They had major social hierarchies and class distinctions. Not just leaders and followers, not just elders and younger people in the family, but you start getting professional warriors that spend all of their time fighting, which means that somebody else has to provide them with food. That's the only way that you can have a professional warrior class. You start getting kings and emperors and that sort of thing. You start getting merchants with trade, and we'll talk more about that when we get to money and I talk about the invention of money. But you start getting merchants whose job is trading. So you start getting major class distinctions. You also start getting major differences between rich and poor. Now, the reason why there can be major difference, and also very important, you also get slavery. Slavery comes about from agricultural societies going to war with each other. First, there are many different kinds of slavery, but the earliest forms of slavery come from agricultural societies that go to war with each other, and they take prisoners of war, and those prisoners of war become the first slaves. But going back to differences and the way that the agricultural revolution changed human life, perhaps the most important thing is you no longer had to focus entirely on survival. You still had to focus on survival. Most humans, for most of human history, for most of human existence, have been engaged in the production of food, whether hunting or gathering on the one hand, or growing crops or livestock on the other hand. It's still production of food. It's still for survival. But in agricultural societies now, you can afford to have people that do other things, that are not farmers. In hunter-gatherer societies, you can't really afford to have people that are not hunting or foraging. In agricultural societies, you can have people that take care of other needs and wants, either their own or those of their neighbors. So these societies no longer focus entirely on survival, but also focus on other needs and wants. Whether it's building permanent buildings out of stone, or studying the stars, which might not seem very useful, but it is actually extremely useful for agricultural societies, because if you learn about the seasons, and if you can predict the seasons based on the movements of the stars or based on other things, then you will know when to sow, when to plow, and so on. That's very important. So studying the seasons, studying the stars actually matters, has a lot of practical importance. So you have that. You have artists. Well, there were artists in hunter-gatherer societies too, but now you can have people that dedicate all of their time to art. I mentioned merchants, I mentioned warriors, and so on. So you have people that take care of other activities. Property, private property comes about. And that is connected to the fact that these societies also have a surplus that can be stored. How are these things connected? Well, it's very simple. now that you're producing crops, some of those crops are going to be things like wheat or corn or rice, and the things about grain in general. And the thing about grain, of course, is that you can store it. You can put it in a large building and just keep it for next year, or maybe for several years. You can eat it later. You can do the same with animals. Of course, you can't really put animals in a warehouse and keep them, but if you're growing animals, if you're not hunting them, then a cow will be with you for a number of years. Likewise with goats and sheep and even chickens. These are things that stay with you because they're animals that you're raising. They're not just animals that you're hunting. So they are also a type of thing, a type of property that you can have. Land, of course, is a major thing. If you're an agricultural society, then you need land to grow your crops. So who controls what land becomes a very important question, much more important than it was for societies of people that moved around all the time. Now, you're sitting in one place. Who controls that place matters. So you get private property. Agricultural societies invent private property in the sense that I mentioned earlier, that people can now own things without physically being there. You can say, this land is mine, even though you don't mean just the land that you're standing on right now and maybe some small area around you, but even you mean, around that corner where you can't see it right now, but if you go there, you'll see it. That's mine too. That's my land. You invent, this concept comes about. Or, that is my horse. Now, maybe I'm not riding the horse right now. Maybe the horse is somewhere else, but that's my horse. Or that's my barn with grain in it. I'm not in the barn right now. I'm not anywhere near the barn right now, but I have a barn. It's my private property. So agricultural societies invent private property because there is something to be owned. There is a surplus, there is land, and so on. This is the agricultural revolution. And it really creates human history as we know it. Writing comes about, actually, in the earliest agricultural societies in Mesopotamia. They invented writing to keep track of stuff. The earliest writing was not for stories. It came to be used for writing stories as well. But the earliest writing was actually something for accounting. So accountants, be proud. Your kind invented writing. It was a way to keep track of how many animals somebody had, or how much grain somebody had. It was a way to keep track of stuff at first. So writing gets invented, permanent buildings, and so on. All of that, the things that we associate with human civilization. All right, now agricultural societies there were many different kinds of agricultural societies, many different systems, from ancient Egypt to ancient Rome to the Middle Ages. And the textbook kind of, not just the textbook actually, other readings as well, kind of sort of lumped these all together under the concept of traditional societies or traditional economic systems. And you'll see talk of, goods and services being produced and distributed according to tradition. People following the profession of their parents. If your father was a blacksmith, then you yourself were going to be a blacksmith, that sort of thing. And yes, that's true. That is a thing that most of agricultural societies had in common. There was, by our standards, very little change from generation to generation. Mostly people did the same things that their parents did and produced the same things that their parents did. That doesn't mean that there wasn't change. Of course there was, just a lot slower than what we're used to. Inventions were made. I mentioned writing. The wheel was invented in there as well. At some point, they invented iron tools. They moved from bronze to iron. Paper, the compass, boats, better boats, sailing boats, rowing boats, different kinds of boats, different kinds of buildings. The pyramids were built by agricultural societies. So was the Colosseum. So there was change, but change was slow from one generation to the next. You might not notice it. You might go a lifetime without really noticing that there's change going on, which is not how life is now, right? So agricultural societies invented things. There were different types of them, which I won't go into. But things advanced slowly by our standards. And that continued to be the case for about 5,000 years. The earliest agricultural societies were, or I should say the earliest agricultural societies with written records, civilizations, were about 3000 BC. So this type of society continued for about 5,000 years, up until, well, the 1700s, really. Up until something else happened called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution. That will be the topic of the next video.